Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry about that technical difficulty, but we are back live. We're about to get started with Tu's Compliment, who's going to give us an incredible workshop. But quickly, I just wanted to quickly go over the polls results. So we asked you, how many amazing things does your company do today that could be turned into a graphic to help tell your story? Now, I know here at the Pet Sustainability Coalition that we do a lot of amazing work, and I bet you do too, right inside of your own company. But we don't always tell everyone about it because we don't have the graphics to be able to tell that in a visually pleasing way. So I answered in this question more than 5. So let's take a look at the results. It looks like, yeah, about 50% of attendees today agree that they have at least 5 amazing things that could be turned into a visual story to help tell the audience and your customers and all of your stakeholders more about who you are as a company and some of the amazing things that you're doing. So that was our #1 leading response. And the least amount of people have 0, at about 10% for 0, 10% for 1 to 3, and then 20% for 3 to 5. So it seems like there's a lot of really amazing things happening out there in all of our companies that we could be doing a better job helping to tell our story visually. Back to you, Katy.
Awesome. Thank you for that data. It's so interesting to even hear that science, because it's such a great kickoff to what I'm about to talk about today, which is understanding what we actually want to track, why we want to track it, and how to tell a compelling story with images and data. So I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, to kick off, I think we are typically very comfortable with the idea of graphics being the most compelling thing with data visualization. The truth is, there's actually some science to what works and what doesn't work, and to actually get started with how you can incorporate it. So, background on us. My background, I worked for NASA, democratizing data sets, with that from like a and organization standpoint. And then I started a company, worked a lot with customers, track customer data, just try to understand how we're using our products. And now I consult with businesses. And we have a firm. That's how I got connected to SC actually. So we help build world-class with data. So you know, 50% of you guys use a lot of graphics. 10% that here is probably wondering, like, why is this important to me? Should I even be interested in something like this? High-level visualization is a mixture of science, data, and art. Mother Nature has so many amazing examples for us of how she tells her own story with her creations. So one of my favorite examples of data visualization in the real world is a tree. A tree ring has a lot that it's telling you about its history. You know, you can see when forest fires happened, or when there was a drought, or what might have happened during that tree's lifetime. And trees are all connected, so they all, you know, share some of that history together. But the most compelling part is actually the rings inside of the tree. You can count the number of rings to tell how old that tree is, which is a super interesting way that Mother Nature tells her own story. So really quickly, a brief history on this. The first infographic or data visualization was actually made by William Playfair in 1789, and he was an economist. So he was interested in looking at socioeconomic landscape at the time, and he just used chart paper to draw different types of charts. And this was really the beginning of what we are currently using today, like bar charts, pie charts, things where you're actually representing hard data using visual images. But still, like, why? Like, I get it, right? Like, nature has some of this stuff. We have some of this stuff in our history, but why is it important? And the real answer is that we demand a visual aspect to information, and you know, we're living in this information world. We're constantly looking for, and if we communicate it effectively, there is an updated version of the data that really well with our brain, as William Clayton mentioned. So it gives us the opportunity to appreciate the most important pieces. And as a business owner, to engage your audience, some of these like tips and techniques actually with the psychology. There was a study that was done, and this is used typically for user experience in building digital products, which is how long is somebody comfortable waiting until something happens on the page. When your website is loading, what's the most comfortable threshold before you kind of lose somebody's attention? And it was 200 milliseconds. So that study was done to evaluate basically the effectiveness of implementing animations or page load times or things that really help to optimize user experience. But MIT researchers actually found that the human brain can process entire images for as little as 13 milliseconds. So this was like the first evidence of pre-attentive processing, which was really exciting to see because as our attention span drops from 12 seconds to 8 seconds, meaning in 8 seconds, we can totally just become disinterested with something. You can capture someone's attention and give them a ton of value and information in 13 milliseconds. So that's kind of the why behind why this is important. It's actually psychological. It's actually part of our chemistry and how we're built as humans. So who's doing this and who's actually doing this successfully? It's become really popular for journalism to be able to tell a broader story using facts and figures using transparent data visualization. So we grew up looking at books and loving the illustration inside of like that first image from National Geographic, where we can compare animals and their sizes to each other, and we can see what it was like for humans to evolve. And that is an illustrative example of the data visualization. But then we also are interested in like what's happening with coronavirus and what's the riskiest type of activity that we can have. And that's just based on, how many people have been actually, diagnosed. So New York Times, The Economist, BBC, NPR, I could go on, but it's becoming quickly like a very compelling way to keep your audience engaged. So what I really want you guys to take away today are 4 main points. The first is, okay, so I understand the why, but what do I need to do? Collect the right data, understand more of the science even behind different charts and graphs and what works best. Thirdly, I want to know some tips and tricks from a designer. So yeah, I want to share that with you guys. And then the last is structuring your narrative. So telling a story that really engages your audience and feels like it's a fulfilling experience for them, no matter what size it is. So we'll start with collecting the right data. So the first thing that you probably want to think about is different types of information sources. So there's, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. So, I just want to touch on it briefly, but there's primary data, secondary data, and then new wave data. Primary is information that you can collect either from, if you have a Google Analytics setup, or if you take surveys like Caitlin just did, or secondary data is data somebody else has collected. So maybe there's like a collective even here where you guys want to source data and you can actually ask to share that data with each other. And big companies are kind of figuring out that data is very valuable. The last is this new wave search and social. So technology enabled, and it can either be primary or secondary data. So you can look on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, you can run surveys on there. You can even just search for this data and find it a lot easier than we were able to in the past. The 2 types of data that you probably want to collect to tell a full story is quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data, as its name implies, is something that can be measured or quantified. This is typically numbers, surveys, statistics, things like that can actually be charted. And then qualitative data, this is more of the human behavior side of things and understanding flows, and when you're looking at life cycle analyses, understanding how something moves through a chain, and observation in words. So our language is a really good example of that. So just a quick example of quantitative is this chart, which I found really interesting. It's actually a full interactive website that documents how women are represented in high fashion based on their color of their skin. And as you can see, you can take a lot away from just looking at this one image if you have that knowledge up front. And it's actually quantitative to an extent because there are years that you're tracking, and then there are shades or hues of color that you are collating. Qualitative is more about like interconnections between things. So a really good example of that is this beer graphic, and you might have even seen it at a brewery or one time or another. It's really fun because it actually shows like how one thing is inspired by another and how there are all these like interconnections between that industry. So that's a really compelling way to map something that can't be quantified, but you want to tell a story. So the next segment is just the science of data visualization. And basically what's cool about this is there are these grandfathers of the science. They were able to actually take data visualization and run their own research projects to find out what the science was behind data visualization, like what actually works. They were able to do this by running a large survey, and they found a hierarchy of like best to worst charts. And they are this group called Cleveland McGill. So they're pretty still trusted when it comes to all of the types of charts that you would use in a data visualization. So I'm just going to start with color saturation. So color saturation is one of the worst. It's actually the worst on its own thing to use to tell a story. So if you're just using colors, the brain can't process that because you're not drawing attention to one piece. It's too difficult. Color can be used as a complementary aspect to other of your charts, but on its own, it doesn't tell its own story. The next is shading, and it's very similar to color. So this is a little bit better, like if we use hatch marks and crisscrosses or different lightnesses or darknesses of contrast. It helps a little bit more, but it still doesn't on its own stand, on its own 2 feet. The third is anything volumetric or 3D. So this performed a little bit better, but it still takes our brains a much longer time to see something. So, you know, like a isometric visualization where you have like cityscape or something like that, and you have facts and figures, it would take your brain a lot longer to process what you're actually trying to get away from that graphic. The third is area or 2D space. So this is like bubble charts, mosaic charts, kind of more like tree maps, as you can see in the image on the bottom in the middle. It is a little bit better again, but it's limited because our brains are so concerned with comparing 2 pieces of data that when we're actually looking at a larger map of many points, it's difficult for us to say, oh, that one purple circle is X times larger than the one next to it, versus the one on the other side of the page. So it's hard for us to take all of that in and accurately depict what's going on. The next one is, unfortunately, like, I think this is a hard one for me to even talk about because pie charts are a favorite. It's one of the most, like, you know, loved ways to display information, but it actually performs really poorly because our brains can't quite calibrate like what an angle is, like what's a 45-degree angle versus a 47-degree angle, or even like a 88 to 90, and like those small percentages can make a huge difference. So if you're looking at it from an overview, it's very helpful because you can take away a large insight. But when you actually have to know the facts and figures and the numbers, it's hard to evaluate that correctly. The next is length. So measuring length. So we're getting a little bit better here. Think like stacked bar charts, waterfall charts, things where you're actually comparing length in like a one-dimensional way. These are pretty effective, and they can be used with position. So position is interesting because this is how our brain best understands things. So like when you are measuring yourself growing up against a wall and you can see that you grew 2 inches last year, that kind of comparison is really fast for our brains to recognize, and that's a really powerful way. But when you add multiple of these together, like say you had 8 siblings and you wanted to compare sister 1 to brother 4, and they're not standing right next to each other, it's really hard for us to understand which of these performed better. And then the best is dot plots, bar charts, position when it's just one single graph and you have one coordinate point. These are excellent ways to tell a story. So Caitlin, this is the part where I actually have a question for everyone. So I'm going to do a little test to exemplify what we're talking about today. And I kind of want to survey, but I think we can do it privately if we can't share those results. I think just even thinking to ourselves or noting what we're seeing on here would be really great. So basically, I'm going to ask you to like compare just looking at these and maybe jot down a response. So in the first race, election 1, is candidate E doing better than candidate C? And that's the first question. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to think about that. The next is who did better between election 1 and election 2? Candidate B or candidate D? Okay, the last is who has the most momentum in the race? So who has, you know, the most traction? Who's gaining the most traction in the race? Cool. So now I'm going to show you a different representation of that data. So I'll ask you guys again. In the first race, is candidate E doing better than candidate C? Who did better between election 1 and election 2? Candidate B or candidate D? And then the last question is, who has the most momentum in the race? If you're wondering right now, like why this is so much easier, it's because of that science that we looked at. Our brain is does a lot better looking at scale and reading more accurate values. What would be even better is if we sat those bars side by side so that we could compare these questions. The last is actually supposed to be the most accurate, which is a dot. It's like a dot chart. But I personally like the bar chart more. So you can kind of, again, see its position, and it's giving you a stacked version of it, just, again, presenting the data a little bit differently. But you can actually see that, you know, green has gained momentum this whole way along. It has that green has the best chance of doing well. And if you stretch these bars out even further, you could further accentuate that information. So diving in just to a few examples, from what we see out in the world, this is where we're comparing adjacent data. So this graph represents how our rhino populations are growing. And we're just looking at two numbers. We just want to see from 2012 to 2018, what was better. And it's an immediate thing that we are actually able to tack on. And what is really great about this data visualization is that the title tells you the story. I think so often we feel more comfortable hiding the information inside of the graph because we really want our audience to be engaged in the information for themselves. But the truth is that, you know, 8-second attention span is it's so critical. And in a world of like TikTok and YouTube, you know, constant change, we need to just give the audience the information right up front. So rhino populations are growing. And then you might ask why, or you might ask how, or, you know, these additional questions which open up the conversation. The next is, you know, yeah, that's great, but like, I actually have data from so many more sources, and I don't want to just compare two pieces of data. I want to show overall how everyone is doing. And this graph is interesting because the title directly influences how you will read the graph. It asks the question, has the US closed the testing gap? So this actually draws your attention towards the United States compared to the other metrics. And overall, you can see that the US is lower. But what they could have done a lot better is they could have actually used color in a more strategic way here. They could have made every other one of the bars gray or something that kind of pushes back the other information that's not important into the background and presented more of the important information in the foreground. So the United States could have been more forefront. And then the last is even more, a little bit like one step more complex. What if I have several points of data, but I want to compare two data sets within this large group? So this example is actually calculating the number of female employees in a tech organization by different tech organizations, and I sorted it by the most female to the least female. And the list goes on, but basically what you can see is the information overlays. So the green represents the male and the red represents the female. So you can see those information's kind of like a stacked bar chart. So overlaying it on top of each other actually really helps your brain to quickly process what this chart is trying to tell you. The third thing that I want to dive in today is visual grammar. And I've hinted at a couple of the techniques with visual grammar that we can use in data visualizations, but I think it's nice to just kind of unpack it and go through it together. I am certainly like no brain scientist, but I do know that there is the language of the eye and the language of the brain, and we touched on it a little bit. Basically, there is iconic memory and pre-attentive processing. And I mentioned pre-attentive processing a little earlier, but basically, iconic memory is that really short term, 13 milliseconds, I see something and I remember it. Pre-attentive processing is that it's the 200 millisecond plus 200 millisecond to 600 millisecond amount of time where you take a little bit more information in and try to actually reconcile what's going on. But what we really want to achieve is not just accessing those little bits of attention. We actually want to get into, the customer's long-term memory and create something extremely important that could potentially change their behaviors or create a closer relationship with you. So some of the tips that we'll be reviewing are the visual tricks like this with the kiwis, where there's just a small amount that's cut out, and it creates this trick to your eye that there's actually a triangle in the middle when there isn't. You can use something like that to capture attention, but the color in this one is really nice because the green stands out so well from the white. And that's kind of the main trick of design, is less is more. You just want to figure out what do you want to draw attention to, and then you want to make that part of the experience. So, you guys are experts of charts at this point. Like, I think, we've gone through all the different types. We understand what works well, what doesn't. And you see something like this online. You might even be like trying to figure out if you want to work with a designer. And you see something like this and you're like, wow, it's so beautiful. It's, really drawing me in. And wow, how do they use the colors like that? Wow, it's structured really interestingly. I can see these 4 sections or whatever. But the truth is, like, when you think about your customers using something like this, what are you trying to get your customers to take away from this dashboard? And I think it doesn't do as well, does it? Like, it looks really beautiful, some really nice little elements, but what I want to hit home is that it's achievable to look both beautiful in your data visualizations, but also be effective with the story that you're telling. And just focusing on the beauty alone is only gets you so far. This is a really good example. I'm a subscriber to the New York Times, partially because I love their interactive data visualization experiences. But this graphic is really nice because they used color, the way that I indicated earlier, to draw your attention into a specific piece. And you can see the trend line of the one specific data point that you're looking for. It's clean, it's well organized. It's not like as eye candy, but what we're trying to take away is, what do I want to learn from looking at this information? And I think this does it really well. The brain contains 4 feature detectors, which are a group of individual neurons that detect important stimuli. And this goes along with that pre-attentive properties of visualization. So how we can use that is color, form, spatial relationship, and movement. Color is one of the best ways. It's like the first thing that you might think of with a data visualization that calls you to attention. You can use it strategically by picking like 1 or 2 or even 3 colors, but you don't want to overpower your audience with too much. As we saw, the color alone does not do well when you're trying to communicate or tell a story. A couple of the other colors that you might just want to be aware of is gray is really great if you're trying to show the data, but you want to have it a little bit more hidden. And then blue is good for color blindness. The last is I'm running up on my time, so I'm just going to run through these really fast. Form is basically what's the shape, size, etc. You can use abstraction like this map where it kind of looks like the US. You can tell it's the US, but instead it's representing, it's using size in an interesting way to tell a story. Spatial relationship is like how close are things together, what's the white space between items. Again, you can blur the background and make the foreground more upfront, emphasizing what's most important. And then the last is movement, and this is like the funnest part about data visualization, is that you can really tell much more of the story that you want and curate it for your audience using this technique. Caitlin, are we still good on a couple minutes, or should I wrap here?
Should go ahead and wrap up. Thanks, Katy.
Great. Yeah, so basically, you know, if anybody wants to reach out or find out a little bit more, I had a little bit more left of telling a story, feel free to email me or reach out to me on Twitter or anything, and I'd be more than happy to share more examples or exercises or ways to think about data and data visualization.
All right, thanks, Katy, for that awesome and in-depth presentation on all the different ways that we can share our story through data. Really appreciate you going over that. Now, we ran a little bit long today from those glitches early on, but I do still want to take a couple of questions from the audience. So we have one here, which is, what are your favorite sustainability visuals? So what have you seen out in the marketplace that really just stand out to you of, you know, sustainability means so many different things to so many different people. So who do you think's really doing a great job in this space?
Yeah, National Geographic is an excellent resource for this, and they have a lab that is dedicated towards this. And the New York Times also has its own sector that does sustainability. But then there's also this new site that's called Pudding, like a pudding cup, and they are pioneering a lot of this work as well.
All right, National Geographic, setting a good example. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Katy, and I'm going to hand it back to Melissa Bauer to introduce us to our next session. And I don't know about you guys, but my tummy is starting to rumble, so I'm feeling lunch in my future. Back to you, Melissa.